The race is on, and Max Verstappen recovered from an 11-second pit stop to catch and pass Lewis Hamilton to claim his 13th win of the season on a day Red Bull sealed the Constructors' Championship. But did Mercedes miss the opportunity it's been waiting for to grab that elusive 2022 race win? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer that question and many more are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Scott, Austin, it's great, isn't it? This is the proper US Grand Prix.
Yeah, it is. I love this race. I love the circuit. I love what they put on around the circuit as well. I think the facility here is excellent. I love the city and everything that is really going on there. There's parts of it that massively embrace the race, and then there's parts of it that are just damn fun to be in, irrespective of whether you're here for a Grand Prix or not. So yeah, this is a proper US Grand Prix. It is absolutely worthy of the name.
The thing I like about this one, Mark, is the fact that it feels like a more organic race. Yes, it's picked up because of all the interest in the wider world of F1 in the US, Drive to Survive and all that. But it was already an event that had its own identity and feel, going right back to that first year we were here back in 2012.
Yeah, absolutely. What the sort of Netflix generation, I think, has brought is a very welcome thing, is that because before that happened, there was a concern that with the Mexican Grand Prix coming, and this being relatively close to the Mexican border, that the future might put the future of this one at risk, and that would have been really, really sad. But that's long gone as a worry, because it's just fantastically successful as well as being wonderfully entertaining.
Yeah, and the thing I just like about it's got its own identity. I think if you want to go to a US race, of the three that we'll have next year, of course, with Las Vegas being added to Miami, this is the one.
Well, to be honest, I think if you're listening to this podcast, I think this is the only one of the three races you'll be able to afford to go to. I can't imagine the people that can afford to go to the Miami and Las Vegas races next year are. I can't imagine we'd have too many massive VIP celebrities listening to this. Not that I don't appreciate our audience. I just think our audience are good, honest, hardworking people, not absolute megabucks millionaires.
Well, there we go. I'm sure you've insulted some people there with your statement, but yeah, this is the race for proper F1 fans. Let's put it that way. Well, Mark, because it's a race for proper fans, let's talk about the race itself rather than the periphery. So, it looked like it was going to be a straightforward win for Max Verstappen after he jumped into the lead at the start, but the wheel gun failure that resulted in an 11-second pit stop gave an opportunity to Lewis Hamilton. Verstappen retook that lead with only 7 laps to go. So, was there a way for Hamilton to win this one?
Ultimately, no. Interestingly, the numbers say that Hamilton was going to take the lead anyway, even without the wheel gun delayed Verstappen's stop, because he was out of the rear tyres had gone on Verstappen's car, and his in-lap pace wasn't enough to counter the out-lap pace of Lewis on his fresh tyres. So Verstappen was going to probably come out just behind Lewis by probably less than a second, which you would assume would then have led to Max retaking the lead under DRS down to turn 12, a bit like what Sergio Perez did when George Russell came out ahead of him. That's just a little sort of incidental, but in terms of could they have taken full opportunity, any fuller opportunity than they did? No, I don't think they could. They just took advantage of a little brief window with the safety car had given them, that had wiped out the 5-second lead Verstappen had built up to that point, just coming up to the second pit stops. In combination with that, at a time that Verstappen's tyres were going away. So ordinarily, if Verstappen's tyres had been going away, but he had a 5-second cushion, it wouldn't have mattered. But it's all of a sudden it did. But with the reset of the fresh tyres, it was back to normal with the Red Bull significantly faster. It probably had about 4/10 on the Mercedes realistically. And so, yes, with Max first had to find his way past Leclerc's Ferrari, of course. But once he'd done that, it was just a matter of chasing it down. And Lewis was pushing like crazy in a car that was very difficult in the slow corners. And eventually it refused to be driven like that for any longer, and he lost a big chunk of time on a couple of consecutive laps with lockups, and that pretty much decided it. And Max was able to sail past under DRS with a 40-kilometre difference into turn 12 with 3 laps to go.
I think it's one of those things that you ask if there's ways to win, but if you don't have the pace of the car and there's a straight line speed disadvantage, particularly with the DRS. What can you do? What did you think, Scott? Could Lewis have delayed the inevitable any longer?
Well, when the race we were watching it live and watched back a couple of the replays at first, I thought that Lewis had given up the position too easily. He didn't really cover Verstappen into turn 12, and it was only when Max made the move, Lewis actually, if anything, he moves just slightly in the braking zone, which is a bit of a no-no normally, but he didn't do anything ridiculous. And that seemed to be the extent of his defence, which, considering he then obviously came back at Verstappen and stuck with him for a few laps, so therefore had a bit of pace to sort of fight him. I thought it was slightly weird that Lewis just left the door open, but they obviously looked into it a little bit more, and there were two factors that I think were easy to overlook because you can't see it from the outside. You just see the effect of it. One, it sounded like the bouncing down the straight, because we know that this circuit is notoriously bumpy, and these cars are really stiff, and probably the Merc is among the absolute stiffest. The mirrors were vibrating so much that by the end of the straight, Lewis actually couldn't see anything in his mirrors, so he had no idea that Max had got that close and was making the move. And I think the other thing that contributed to that is that Max had, that 40 odd kilometre an hour overspeed because of Hamilton derating and the Red Bull being quick in a straight line and in the tow and with the DRS. So I think those two factors combined to make it explained why Lewis wasn't covering a move, because I literally think he literally couldn't see it coming.
I think overall it shows that Mercedes have made progress with this car, but this really, Mark, was just another one to add to those few races we've had this year where there's been a flirtation with victory for Mercedes when circumstances have gone for it. But the fact that quite a few circumstances helped here, Sainz out, Leclerc grid penalty, Verstappen having his time delay, and still there wasn't really a way to win it. It tells you how big that assist needs to be for Merc to be able to win.
All those plus an opportunity time safety car, and still it wasn't quite enough. So yeah, absolutely, and that's about the size of it, really. The gap to the Red Bull was a little bit narrower than the average, but ultimately, it should you'd normally expect that deficit to translate into fifth and sixth on the grid, and for you to be fifth and sixth in the race when Verstappen had his problems, and therefore you wouldn't be able to be a beneficiary. It's a lot of things all came together, and it just gave a little suggestion of what it might look like if we had a fully competitive Merc, but it was a misleading picture. It was a bit of a mirage.
And the fact that this is a bumpy circuit, which doesn't play to the strengths of the car, I think it's gently encouraging for Mercedes. It's not transformative, but they were at least able to make it interesting through to the closing stages. But Scott, it was no surprise that Red Bull sealed the Constructors' Championship crown. That's been inevitable for ages. It's his first Constructors' title since 2013. But it did become far more than that, given Red Bull co-founder Dietrich Mateschitz passed away during this race weekend. So the timing couldn't really have been more appropriate, could it?
No, it was a very fitting way to remember Mateschitz and honour his life and his legacy. Obviously, it's sad. We got the news just before qualifying, so unfortunately he wasn't able to be around to witness the constructors' title. But he was obviously able to see Max become a two-time world champion. And he would have known that the team was on course to win that double, and with a good chance of finishing first and second in the Drivers' Championship as well, which Red Bull's never done before, has it? Webber never finished second, did he, in the Vettel years? So, the timing of it, one of the factors that was obviously Red Bull would much rather it had absolutely no distraction at all, given the nature of it, but it moved the narrative this weekend away from something more controversial. We've obviously came into this weekend with the backdrop of the budget cap breach and what would happen to Red Bull. There were negotiations through the weekend between Red Bull and the FIA, but that all got paused basically in the wake of Matschitz's death, and there was also basically a truce on what was quite a bitter war of words developing between the rival teams. For example, Mercedes didn't want to talk about politics or anything like that in Toto Wolff's media sessions out of respect. It just shifted the narrative onto the on-track stuff and honouring Mateschitz, which meant that probably for the first time in a couple of Grand Prix, Red Bull was able to win a race without there being a massive cloud around it. Politically speaking, obviously this was very sad, and I feel like all of the tributes that we heard from Red Bull personnel, past and present, this weekend, they were very, very heartfelt. Whatever people's opinion might be about the Red Bull F1 organisation at the moment, that they have their critics. Some criticisms are valid, some of them are over the top. It's very difficult to find some of a bad word to say about Mateschitz. So he had a huge impact on Formula One, and those that knew him only really have kind words to say about him.
You have to say, Mark, he's been profoundly influential in shaping modern F1. And in fact, you don't even really need to caveat it as modern F1. He's up there with one of the most influential people in Grand Prix history, isn't he?
Absolutely, yeah. And if you look at all, and even outside of motor racing, he's in all sorts of sports and activities. But yes, I mean, in terms of not just 2 Grand Prix teams, but you've got all the junior driver programs. You've got all the I think 8 drivers on the current grid, as well as all of those who've passed through and got on to other things. Owe their careers to this guy and this guy's vision of how he wanted to market his drinks company, and amazing vision and full-on commitment and enthusiasm that he did all this with, and there was no holding back. And he of course gave us the Austrian Grand Prix back after a long absence, which is a very welcome thing, a beautiful circuit that he'd taken over and brought back up to standards. But he's done so much, and for this to be the effort of a one guy is quite remarkable, really. And you could liken his influence in the sport to that of in previous decades of Marlboro, but obviously without the tobacco connotations. But it's as pervasive as that. It's in terms of how many categories it's involved in, and how many drivers' careers it's responsible for.
I was on the Amp Fast and Loose show after the race, and one of the things I mentioned on there was, just to try and put it into context, was I can't think of a single individual who shaped F1 more other than perhaps Bernie, but certainly no one has left such an imprint on Formula One with such little profile. I feel like that's the big point of distinction, is everybody knows Bernie and everybody knows the impact he made on Formula One. But outside of our little bubble, how many people have heard of Mateschitz?
Yeah, Red Bull has this huge profile, but the guy himself, hardly any.
Exactly.
It's exactly how he wanted it.
But the thing that's really positive about him is, I think he was in F1 for the right reasons. Now, you can talk about the way Red Bull do things, etc., and some people like it, some people don't, or whatever. But at heart, he just loved racing, and that was what it was. It was a passion project for him, hugely successful. And I think that's something that you have to really like about him. I always remember seeing him at the Austrian Grand Prix, obviously his race, his area, his part of the world, when Max Verstappen won it for the first time for Red Bull in 2018, and he was just sort of charging across the paddock, just a guy who was delighted. And if you'd said to someone, "Oh, pick out the billionaire person who owns all this," they wouldn't have picked him out, because he didn't have the air of that. And I mean that in a positive way. He seemed part of it, even though he was reclusive and didn't like the limelight. When he was there, he just looked like a guy who was having a good time.
I quite like that part of the Red Bull tribute today was that all the team members were wearing jeans instead of the normal team trousers, which I thought was quite a nice touch.
And playing the Rolling Stones music as well, because that was a big thing of his.
I'm pretty sure when I saw him at Austria, I mentioned he had jeans and his kind of suede jacket on. That was his, and his check shirt as well. He like, I've got a check shirt on in tribute to Mateschitz. I could claim, although I think that's more coincidence. But yeah, I think it's good that among all of the negativity there's been about Red Bull, some of it earned, some of it overblown, to actually remember that this is a company that's done a lot in F1, a lot for F1, and achieved a lot, and celebrate a little bit Mateschitz' contribution, I think is appropriate. Congratulations to everyone at Red Bull Racing for the Drivers and Constructors Championship double. Right, let's talk Ferrari now, Mark. Given Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc were first and second in qualifying, to come away with just a third place for Leclerc, sort of another disappointment, isn't it? How hard done by was Sainz at the first corner?
A little bit. It was a little bit unfortunate, and it was just he was sort of pincered, but he was also partly responsible. Once he'd lost the place to Verstappen off the line and into the corner, and he had the other Mercedes behind him looking to take advantage of any impeding of his progress by Verstappen. Carlos cut across very sharply, really, and shouldn't really have been surprised that there was a car there already. So, I think he has to take some of the blame for that.
It's that element of risk, isn't it? It wasn't outrageous or stupid or anything. You just had to take that gamble. And George Russell was quite happy to say after he held up his hands, he said, yeah, my fault, because he had the little lock-up. He went a bit deeper than he wanted. But I did also ask him, well, if Carlos had stayed where he was, do you think you'd have made it round okay? And he was we'd have had no problem with it. So it's that predominantly to blame thing, isn't it? Yeah,
I think a 5-second penalty for Russell was fine for that, but at the same time, slightly surprised. Not because this isn't because I think George wasn't to blame, but I was surprised that it was met with a penalty, given we normally have a degree of leniency on the opening lap, and this was the first corner at a track with a first corner that encourages cars to go 2, 3, you can probably go 4, 5 wide actually into turn one. A few lines through it, there was the trajectory of the Ferrari does have an impact on the ultimate trajectory of the Mercedes, or where it ends up mid corner. So there were quite a few factors there that I thought played into the usual leniency we see on the first lap. But
I suspect it was the lockup that made the difference. I'm not saying it should have done, but I do wonder if that was the thing that...
Didn't that doom Gasly last year in Turkey? There was... Do you remember
the Gasly Alonso?
Yeah, it was really silly. It was just absolutely no way, shape or form did it meet the criteria for that to be a penalty, and yet he got one anyway. So every now and again we do see this on the first corner. I don't mind them blaming George for it. I do think he was predominantly to blame. The 5-second penalty is fine. It was just it felt like you could have argued it as it's his fault, but no penalty.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And we should say in Sainz's case, he didn't make the greatest of starts. He was behind by the first corner, so a small part he put himself in that position by not making a better start. Although this very much is a track where starting second can be a pretty good thing. Quite often, in fact, the majority of the time, I think recently, whoever's been second has been ahead at that first corner. But how about Charles Leclerc, Mark? He had a good, strong race, didn't he, from down the grid? The 10-place grid penalty, he was second fastest in qualifying, so quite a lot of work to do, and came out with third place.
He did, and what was very encouraging for Ferrari about Leclerc's race was how long he was able to go on the tyres. And since the summer break, really, or certainly since Hungarian Grand Prix even, Ferrari have struggled to get good tyre performance in the race for whatever reason. And here, although they didn't change the car here, they were really good on the tyres at a circuit that's very, very demanding of them. It was actually better on the tyres in that first stint than either the Red Bull or the Mercedes. And that's highly unusual. And so, his tyres dropped off a little bit in that last stint, which was why Max was able to repass him after his pit stop delay. But I think that was more of how hard Leclerc had pushed when he was coming out. But I think, it was very encouraging to see that it could combine the pace with the good stint length, and that's the first time we've seen that in the second half of the season, really.
That means it probably has to go down as a quietly positive weekend for Ferrari overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the results fairly modest given the performance in qualifying, but again in their front row, well, not the front row because they didn't start on the front row, but their first and second fastest times in qualifying was also to do with tyre usage. It had better tyre usage than the Red Bull. They could more easily fire it up and fire the front tyres up in particular, but without the usual concomitant penalty of that in the race.
Yeah, and so I think that's mission accomplished in terms of that aim to finish the season well for them for this race. Obviously, it's not a great result in terms of the wider scope of the season, but pretty positive for them. We should mention Sergio Perez had a relatively quiet run to fourth. He had that bit of front wing damage, didn't he, Scott, from the contact with Bottas early on. So a quiet race for Perez, but he did have that little bit of an aero disadvantage with the front wing because it wasn't changed at any point in the race.
Yeah, and I thought he did a good job to make sure he was ahead of Russell. I think in the end, the pass. Which pit stop was it when he got back ahead of got ahead of Russell, because they rejoined, didn't he? And Russell briefly got.
Russell rejoined ahead, and then he retook up down at turn 12.
Yeah. I thought that Perez did a good job to make sure he got in front, but as it turns out, Russell was struggling so much with his own front wing damage that I think it was absolutely inevitable that Perez was going to comfortably beat the second Mercedes. It was ended up being a quiet performance from him. I thought the complaint was in the fight with Leclerc, that we had the complaint over the radio about him going off track and passing him, which I just thought was a wafer thin claim from Perez. So while this was a quiet and less punchy performance than we've seen at other races, and a slightly muted contribution to Red Bull's day of days clinching the Constructors' Championship, you've only got to look at the job he's done over the course of this year as the support act of Verstappen in that car. He has more than played his part in Red Bull winning this Constructors' Championship. It's not like he's got like 25-30% of Verstappen's total or anything like that. So, grand scheme of things, Perez has done a really good job this year as the number 2 driver at Red Bull. He's done what he was signed to do, but this was just one of those weekends where he was just always a little bit at arm's length, basically, from that lead battle.
And with George Russell in 5th, I was quite pleased after the race because he was asked about getting the fastest lap point because he had the pit stop and he just described the fastest lap point as unnecessary. So he said, well, you just get new tyres just because you're in the position, it's situational. I like that because that agrees with my perspective and on things. So I'll just amplify him agreeing with me on on that one. Well, let's catch up on Grid Rival now. Grid Rival is the fancy motorsport game where you can take us at the race on in our own league. A solid but unspectacular 893 points for me this week, Scott, partly thanks to compromises in my team caused by being locked out of a few big names and my gamble on Mick Schumacher as double points talent driver. Enough to beat you?
No, nowhere near. I've crashed through the 1,000-point barrier for the second time. So very, very happy with my week. I think I outscored the people that are leading our league as well. So I had a lovely mix. I had Verstappen and Hamilton for starters. I had Vettel as my talent driver, and then I had did I have Norris and Magnussen as well, and I had Alpine as my team. So my only concern is I would imagine the topic we will get onto very, very shortly. I wonder if Alonso's post-race penalty is going to cost me a little bit there. But when I checked before there were any post-race amendments, I was on a 4-figure sum for the for this week. So very, very happy and very proud of myself. I'm very smug because I'm absolutely destroying you now.
Actually, we should say this is caveated because we've only just had those penalties. So some of these details might change in Grid Rival, but we can only do it as it is now. The top score for the United States Grand Prix on that basis was these tyres are dead with 1,107, thanks to a team of Leclerc, Norris, Verstappen, Hamilton, Vettel and Mercedes. So that's not going to be affected by the penalties, I would say. So probably will stay on top. But just a narrow win, only 4 points ahead of Shippo is a legend. And overall, in that battle, we've got a change of lead. Raniel Ricciardo has moved into the lead, just 3 points ahead of Jackie 789-58103. And that battle is definitely going all the way down to the last lap in Abu Dhabi. So make sure you click on the link in the episode description, sign up for Grid Rival. There's only 3 races to go this season, but get a feel for the game so you can go into next season in good form. Right, Scott, the battle for best of the rest behind the big 3 provided loads of action in this race. Lando Norris ended up coming through to win that fight in 6th place, a very well executed drive from him. But how surprised were you to see Fernando Alonso finishing 7th on the road, and we'll come back to that particular qualifier in a bit, after being launched into the wall by contact with Lance Stroll?
Oh, I was totally surprised. I shouldn't be because he's sort of done this before, hasn't he, in the Azerbaijan Grand Prix a few years ago. But there was a comment Alonso made a couple of races ago about the Alpine, which is just it seems to be able to bounce off other cars and actually survive.
He said today, if you hit an Alpine, you DNF.
Yeah, exactly. So there is something about it. I wouldn't like to suggest that means that the drivers take needless risks with it, but and we'll come to this again shortly. Apart from the wing mirrors, they build them really, really strong in Endstone. So I was genuinely surprised to see that he was able to to continue, I felt for sure that was going to have some kind of terminal damage on it. So continuing was a big surprise to me. The fact that he was then able to Alonso it into the top 10 was just another bit. Once it was able to continue, I just thought, well, who knows what he's going to do with this?
I must admit, I can't think of a car having that kind of impact and continuing at a relatively unabated speed in a race in the past. Yes, sometimes you see contact and that kind of thing, but that was big. But there's a question here from Dan Elliott from the Race Members Club. Of course, the Race Members Club can ask us questions in our post-race podcast. Just head to therace.com and don't forget the hyphen and click on Join the Race for more information on that. But Danny Elliott's question is, as we know, this sport is partly a battle to reduce weight and have the required weight in the right places. With this in mind, why does the Alpine suspension have enough play and extra travel to survive an impact like we saw in this race?
I don't know if it does. It just took the hit in a place that it didn't matter. It could so easily have plucked a wheel off, just as it did with Stroll's Aston. I think once it's got all its wheels on and it's still going, like Scott said, anything's possible because it's Alonso. I mean, who else could, be that far up in the air and still be going afterwards, rejoin last, and then come through all over again?
He was quite interesting when he talked about it, because he said when he had the impact, he wasn't completely sure how far across the track he was.
Yeah.
So when he got launched, he said, actually, I thought it was further over to the left, and he thought he was going to have an IndyCar-style accident into the fence and sort of spinning around off it. So he was quite relieved when he landed.
Well, he did an IndyCar-style recovery, because obviously the only other person I can think of that would do this would be Marcus Ericsson, who obviously won the Nashville IndyCar race in 2021, having gone up the back of another car and gone completely airborne. But that was, I remember watching that race, that was utter chaos. And IndyCar is a very different kettle of fish to Formula One. So it's obviously, it's a bit apples and oranges. But it did remind me of that when I saw that Alonso was not only still going, but also still going at a fair rate. I was thinking, this is ridiculous. The only example I can think of is arguably the most chaotic recent race in IndyCar history.
And a 3-place grid penalty for Lance Stroll for causing an incident. Fair, Mark?
I suppose so. If you have to give out penalties, yeah. He moved left, but at the same time, I think Alonso was going for the dummy, actually. So I think Alonso had initiated the move left. Lance had responded maybe a little bit late by going left also, but not outrageously so, I didn't think. And then I think it looked like Alonso was then thinking, okay, I'm going to go right then. But it was too late, and I think there was an element of 50-50 about that accident.
Yeah, I think there's an element as well of, with the Stroll penalty, it's always frowned on the late move, so I think there's a little bit of that in it. The one thing that was quite interesting is Alonso, when he spoke after the race, after he'd been to the stewards, he was quite conciliatory about it, and I think that's probably partly because he's going to be Lance Stroll's teammate next year. What's the point in causing problems about it? But he did say it was all fine, and I said, well, he did move quite late, though, didn't he? But Alonso did one of his great exaggerations, because he said those movements, 1/10 of a second, you move 200 metres, which was quite impressive. We worked out, Scott, didn't we, how fast, therefore, if he was covering 200 metres in a tenth of a second, what's that, 7,200 kilometres an hour?
Yeah, I think it was something like that. We did work it out. I can remember it being around 7,000 kilometres an hour. So that Alpine was going some. We were joking, like Lance never stood a chance.
Well, no, because well beyond the speed of sound, so he wouldn't have heard it, or let alone saw it. So, yeah.
How bad's that car in the corners, though?
I know.
But yeah, great drive from Alonso. But Scott, we did not long ago learn that Alonso's 7th place actually was an illusion, thanks to Haas successfully protesting Alpine. So what was all that about?
Haas basically lodged 2 protests after the race, one against Sergio Perez's car and the other against Alonso's car, basically for driving in an unsafe condition. And this felt a little bit like doing it to prove a point, because 3 times this year Kevin Magnussen's been given a mechanical flag for driving with the front wing end plate broken and therefore flapping around, and Haas have consistently argued that this is not dangerous, and I think after the second time it happened, they even went to the FIA and said, look, stop doing this, because here's all the data. It is not a risk. If it's flapping, it can't fall off.
Well, and they were annoyed about it because they'd done that before the Singapore one, and so they thought, actually, when it happened in Singapore to Magnussen, he wasn't going to get the
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I was going to say. So then they were really furious in Singapore when after doing this, he still got one anyway. So I think here they saw that Perez had the front wing end plate flapping early on, but then that fell off. And then later on in the race, a few laps from the end, Alonso's wing mirror came off, I think, as he passed Magnussen as well. So that would obviously have been in Haas's scopes. So they did the protest afterwards. The Red Bull one got thrown out. It's lacking detail, the FIA's decision. But basically what they've said is that because the front wing end plate fell off, completely detached and disappeared off the car, after that point onwards, the front wing was in a safe condition. So I can only have to infer from that the FIA, the race control were considering or going to eventually give Perez a mechanical warning flag once they'd realised, but it fell off before they could. So that was that. But on Alonso's, I don't know about this as a precedent, but the stewards have basically determined that race control were wrong not to give Alonso a mechanical flag, that he should have been forced to pit and deal with it, because they've determined that it was dangerous not only to be driving with the wing mirror broken and flapping, but also to have no mirror on the car at all. But their ire seems to be directed more at race control, because Haas apparently made 2 calls to race control to alert them of the flapping mirror, and no action was taken. So they're annoyed at race control, but at the same time they've gone, ultimately it's the team's responsibility to make sure the car's in a safe condition. Alpine didn't do that, so hit Alonso with a stop-go penalty converted into a time penalty after the race, which dropped him out of the points. I mean, I don't know. That I kind of see where they're coming from, but I really feel like this could open a can of worms. Yeah, that drops Alonso down to 15th place in the end and moved Vettel up to 7th and Magnussen up to 8th. But it's a strange one, because even without Haas notifying them, you'd have thought race control was looking quite closely at that Alpine, given it had just been hurled into a wall. So that's a strange thing, and the wing mirror was flapping. So yeah, I can understand why they feel it was a little bit of a strange one, but a bit of a shame for Alonso. But where do we stand on this kind of thing, this after the fact penalising someone for having a car with broken parts? Well, they've been penalised for race control not doing its job effectively. And it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because this does set a precedent for any kind of slightly deranged bit of bodywork or whatever being a problem. Does that mean if someone's wing mirror falls off in future, randomly, that they're always automatically going to get a penalty? I think it means that if your wing mirror gets knocked off, you have to retire. Well, yeah, by definition, that's the case, isn't it? That's the precedent.
Or have a new one fitted, however long.
Well, I suppose you could do that, yeah.
We're going to see all sorts of things now being practiced in testing at the start of the season. Do you remember a few years ago when McLaren had to do that steering wheel change for Hamilton? And I remember it being explained by the team afterwards, and so this is one of the things that we do occasionally practice in testing. We just hope we never have to do it. I wonder if we're now going to start to see all sorts of weird things being trialled in testing, like rapid wing mirror repairs and botched jobs on front wing end plates and that kind of thing.
We're going to start to hear complaints to race control with people saying, diff sounds a bit rattly. I think something might fall off there. A whole new area of combat in F1. But also it's significant in that battle for 4th in the Constructors' Championship. The gap now is 6 points in Alpine's favour over McLaren. Obviously, they gained from that. They did get an extra point for Ocon thanks to the penalty, but obviously they lost the points for Alonso.
It's also significant in the battle for 6th, because it's nudged Aston Martin up another position, hasn't it? So it's just another 2 points that are taken out of Alfa Romeo. And when you're looking at a battle like that, where there are so few points overall and so few points in it, it's quite a big percentage shift.
And on that topic, actually, we should talk about Aston Martin, Mark. One of its most competitive showings of the season at Austin, could easily have ended up 6th and 7th at the front of the midfield. That's where they were aiming for early on. We've covered Stroll's demise, and we'll get on to Vettel's troubles in a moment. But first, a question from Chris Parrott, who asks, what was the key to Aston Martin's pace this weekend?
It's been building, actually, because what you got to remember about the Aston Martin is that it was... its proper car only really came out in Spain, because the first one was a disaster and they hurriedly made another one based on a completely different aerodynamic concept. And that car took part in a Grand Prix in a state of the team understanding and levels of preparation that you would normally only see in winter testing.
Well, we were speaking to Andy Green the other day, and he said it wasn't even really. It was almost not a launch car. It was almost before that.
Yeah, exactly. So they're starting several races behind, if you like, everybody else. If you consider their proper season started at Barcelona. So yeah, this is just building understanding. There's been upgrades and there's been weight reduction like everybody else, but this is really more to do with getting a fuller understanding as they've gone on with a car that was so different from the original one.
And 26 points they've scored in the last 3 races, Aston Martin, and as we mentioned, it could have been much better. Scott, a question from Danny Elliott, who says, Vettel had a great race today. How many laps was he in the lead? Well, he officially led 2 laps, I can confirm that. His first of the year. Shame about his pit stop. What happened there?
Aston Martin boss Mike Crack, when I spoke to him, didn't have an exact answer for how this happened, but basically it seems like an alignment issue on the front jack, so that when the car was lifted, it effectively rolled off slightly to the side, which meant the front left, they had some problems getting it on, but then also front getting it off, but then mainly getting it on and then getting the tightening the nut. So they then had to do a jack change, get it back up, drop it back down, and then get it back up again, and then they were able to finish it and then set Vettel on his way. So I can't remember how long that pit stop took, but I remember watching it and thinking, this feels like an absolute eternity.
Yeah, it was very, very painful. It dropped him down, I think, at that point to 13th place. And he did do quite a good job to battle his way back through from there. Had that great last lap battle with Magnussen. This was a good weekend from Vettel. I know qualifying he underachieved a little bit, but showed good fighting spirit, I think.
It did, yeah, and those last few corners with Magnussen, he absolutely on the limit. You know, your car was trying to throw him off the circuit, and you no way he was backing off. He absolutely wanted that place, and you're thinking, this is, for a guy that's about to retire in 3 races' time, it's quite impressive level of commitment.
I like that move on Albon, the one around the outside of the triple apex near the end of the near the end of the lap. Basically, just to pick up on what Mark was just saying there about a guy heading into retirement, he's not phoning it in, is he? The Aston Martin have talked about, I mean, we would obviously never question this given his character, but they've talked about Vettel's ultimate professionalism and the commitment to the cause to the very end. And just if anyone needed any proof of this, like the way he is driving in these last few races, it shows that. I think he's enjoying the fact that the car's more competitive. He's able to race for better positions. Again, this ultimately still isn't what he really cares about, but he's finding motivation in it, isn't he? And he's doing a very, very good job of it. You can't fault him for his commitment or his execution. And
he's got the motivation of his great battle for 6 in the Constructors' Championship. Okay, Aston Martin wants to do more than 6, but that would be a really good recovery from them. Only 1 point now. Alfa Romeo's ahead. And Scott, Alfa Romeo was a genuine top 10 car on pace at Austin. Came away empty-handed again. Now just that 1 point ahead. How surprised were you that Bottas parked it in the gravel?
Very. I'm not sure if I was quite as surprised as he was. He was quite baffled by it. When we spoke to him immediately, well, during the race when he was coming through the mix zone, he did say it was odd, and he said he'd been told by the team that it did seem that there was a big gust of wind at that point. I think you heard a specific number, like 25 kilometers
25 kilometres an hour more than it had been.
Yeah, so Bottas did say that, but he also said ultimately it was his mistake. I mean, for all the criticism that gets levied at him, and we've visited Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner several times over the years, him just dropping it in the dry is unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of those things that happens. I mean, ultimately, yes, it's his mistake, but the wind sensitivity is there. It's been there all weekend as well, the gusts, and that is a particularly tricky part of the track for that. But yeah, just one of those things that happened, but very badly timed. And Zhou Guan Yu couldn't quite get into the points either, which is a shame. Actually, he's been quite quick this weekend. He was actually faster than Bottas in Q2, but had that lap disallowed for a turn 12 track limits violation. He started down in 18th, I think, because he had a grid penalty as well. But Joe performed pretty well, didn't have a great strategy, ended up doing the majority of the race on hard compound tyres, which wasn't ideal, but no points for Alfa Romeo. And Mark, we should quickly talk about AlphaTauri. Yuki Tsunoda ended that long points drought with 9th place, but Pierre Gasly was a very unhappy man after his pair of penalties and the brake glaze problems he had on Saturday. Do you think his irritation's justified?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, the penalty for the safety car gap was a bit unfortunate because, as he pointed out, that if the guy ahead of you suddenly accelerates, you're right up behind him, and he suddenly accelerates. There can be just the reaction time can mean that you get too far behind the car in front under the safety car.
I tend to think those sorts of penalties should be reserved for people deliberately playing games, rather than just something like that, the ebb and flow.
Yeah, and it also makes it ridiculously complicated to monitor if you're going to have to monitor every single gap between every single car and every single safety car. Why are we doing that? Why is it necessary to go to that detail? I don't think it is.
Yeah, that's not a great thing. I think it's one of those ones where if you've got somebody playing games like Hungary with Red Bull when Vettel backed up the field when Webber was leading, that was a bit cynical and rightly it was penalised. But yeah, I think I can understand why Gasly was annoyed, although his patience clearly is wearing thin with the AlphaTauri team. I get it. I get where it comes from because they've underachieved this season. There have been a lot of weekends where problems outside of his control have held him back. There's been strategic errors like in Singapore. There's been that timing error in qualifying that cost him a shot of being best of the rest in Monaco. Some engine problems, etc. So it has been difficult and quite trying for them, but he's clearly quite happy to be out the door at the end of the year.
Yeah, clearly. And there's a frustration coming through. And that's, it's understandable, but it's also something that other teams will be taking note of. And it's not a good thing to have associated with you professionally. So, it's something he needs to watch.
Yeah, you get where it's coming from, but it's not necessarily constructive. It's not a quick vent and then off you go. So let's be a little bit careful on that, but at least you can sympathise with where it's coming from. Well, as always, we'll finish off by working through some of the Race Members Club questions. Thanks to everyone who sent one in. Mark, first, a question for you from Mark O'Neill. With Max clinching the driver's title last race and Red Bull with a constructor's title at COTA, will they now prioritise Checo or use Max to help Checo in the remaining races?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because if they're now targeting getting Checo up to second, what better way of doing that than to try and get him to win his home Grand Prix next week? And whether Max is prepared to buy into that plan, I don't know, but maybe he is. If you look back on Spain, for example, Max couldn't have won that Grand Prix without Checo's help. Well, once Max had gone off into the turn 4 gravel, he really needed Checo's help to win that race to come back through. So he sort of owed one. So what better way than to give him his home Grand Prix if at all possible? I mean, it's a bit presumptive to think that that is obviously doable, because it could turn out that the Ferraris are quick enough to prevent that. But if that opportunity is there, I don't see why they wouldn't. To perfectly legitimate aim to try and get the guy that needs the points the most to put him in front of the other guy.
Yeah, and a Perez win in Mexico would be great. I mean, it's possible he could win it without any assistance. That's always a possibility. But yeah, I think it would make sense for them to maybe be accommodating, certainly in Mexico, because I think that would be brilliant for the race. And he's played a really important role. I think Perez, yes, he's had some very difficult times, but he has picked up the points. And as Scott said earlier, he's got a chance of being the first Red Bull driver to complete a 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship. So for you, Scott, question from Thomas Knights, who says, while Norris is fighting brilliantly and really taking it to Alpine, how frustrating is it for him and McLaren for it to be a one-man challenge as Ricciardo looks further off the pace with every weekend?
I think it's more of a frustration for McLaren than Norris, because honestly, I know that Ricciardo's reputation has taken a beating over the last 18 months, but it's because of Norris. The longer that Ricciardo struggles, really, and the worse these gaps are, the better Norris looks, because he's just absolutely destroying him. But for McLaren, it's massively problematic because Alpine has just collectively just underachieved at times this year. Both their drivers have got almost identical number of points, but because of reliability problems or whatever, they've lost a lot. Norris hasn't. I can't really think of any times this year Norris has really dropped points or not scored when he should have, or had McLaren-related problems.
And this was a really good weekend from him again.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas the missing McLaren points in the championship are just almost all on the other car's side, on Daniel's side. So while Norris is obviously quite often played up the fact that it shouldn't be a fight, Alpine should be up the road, I would argue that if Ricciardo was scoring points at a rate that was more appropriate, that McLaren should be up the road. So that's where I think the main frustration will lie.
Yeah, and I think Ricciardo now has pretty much accepted it's not going to happen. There's only 3 races left. He was saying at the end of the race, I'm not going to hope or expect or think. And he's tried everything he can multiple times to make it work, and it hasn't. So I think I'm not going to say he's checked out, but let's put it this way. I don't think he's going to be unhappy to get Abu Dhabi over and done with and move on to other things.
This would have been a really particularly painful one as well, because he came away from Suzuka with a sneaking suspicion that actually the upgrade to the McLaren might have helped him a little bit, just sort of given him a bit more feel and made things feel a bit normal. He was hoping that would be confirmed this weekend, but if anything, it's just been emphatically disproven.
Next up for you, Mark, is a question from Jack Aitken. Presumably not that Jack Aitken, but it may be. Either way, we're very happy to answer the question, which is, I've loved seeing Fernando Alonso battling at the front of the midfield this season, but Aston Martin's pace today has given me confidence he may continue to pop up at the pointy end next year. What are the strengths of the 2022 Aston, and would the car's characteristics suit Fernando's driving style?
I think in terms of car traits and driving style, it doesn't really matter. Alonso's probably the most adaptive driver on the grid. He doesn't really have a driving style. He's had several distinctive driving styles through his career, but it's just whatever is required to sort of get the car to do what he wants it to do. So I think he can drive anything. It's more a question of how competitive will that car be. I don't think it's to do with its traits in particular. I think it's just aerodynamically, where's it going to be? Where's it going to stack up against the likes of Alpine, against McLaren, against that? It's pretty serious teams in that midfield, that upper midfield. So yeah, it's got great ambitions, and it's invested heavily, and it's had some very impressive recruitments. But it's still got to be brought together, and it's making progress back end of this year, so that's encouraging. But yeah, I'd still not be confident of saying it's definitely going to go in and pull away from Alpine or McLaren. These are serious teams, so let's see. I don't know.
Alonso will certainly be quick in it, whatever happens. Next question on a similar topic, Scott, is from Liam Robinson, who says, do you believe, in light of his incredible performance today, that Fernando Alonso would be able to fight for wins and maybe even a title if he had the car? He consistently shows that he belongs in the top tier along with Verstappen and Hamilton, and finishing P7 after his Alpine turned into a Boeing 747 surely shows this.
Yeah, I have to agree with Liam, and short answer, but not out of disrespect to the question, just what more is there to say? There is no evidence to suggest that Alonso would not be capable of fighting for wins and a title in the right car. He's clearly, I don't know if he's absolutely at his peak and as good as he was in 2012, like he often has pointed out this year. But if he's adrift of that peak, it's adrift by a negligible amount. So he's absolutely good enough to fight for titles.
Next up for you, Mark, from Danny Elliott. Why do we have a non-enthusiastic checkered flag waver in Tim Cook from Apple? Clearly wasn't interested, and I was a touch annoyed watching his pathetic attempts to wave the finish flag. Just go back to a normal finish procedure with a standard checkered flag. Why do Formula One even bother with celebrity finishes?
Well, I'm glad you got that off your chest. It doesn't get me quite so angry to see an expressionless guy waving the flag, but at least he waved it at the right car, unlike Pele a few years ago. And, Pele's a legend, so whatever, I don't really mind.
I thought it was rubbish. I'm not as angry as Danny Elliott is, but I did think it was rubbish.
It wasn't. I mean, it's this weird part of F1, this kind of obsession with the celebrities or figures of great stature in other fields. It's just not that relevant.
What I don't understand. Like, I saw a few people getting excited about this, about him being here. Why does it matter that the boss of a company is here? I don't understand.
Well, he's significant.
No,
Obviously.
I get that. But like, lots of people are significant.
Apple's
He's not
hugely
the president.
significant. People wouldn't be listening to us necessarily in the way they are with Apple. So no question there. But yeah, it just seemed a little bit odd. I'm sure there's better things he could be spending his time.
I'm sure there's better things he can do as well.
Yeah, no question. That's waving a checkered flag is probably not.
Is that why my new iPhone's rubbish? Is his standard of phone making now? Is his standard of phone making as bad as his standard of flag waving?
So you just gone through the motions with his business and the way he is in the flag waving.
Is that how enthusiastic they are at Apple?
My Apple phone's brilliant. I'm really happy with that.
Have you got a personal sponsorship Apple? Because you leapt to Tim Cook's defence a second ago, so something's up here.
I'm just knowing
you're on the payroll. I get it.
I just don't want this podcast to stop getting through to people who may listen to it for whatever reason.
If we disappear from iTunes, I'm really sorry, and you can blame me.
Absolutely, but no, my iPhone's doing a good job. Anyway, Scott, now we've got a pair of questions from regular questioner Christopher Partridge, but with a difference. So these are from his kids. So first up is from James Partridge, who is 10 years old, who says, "Hi, James here. Do you watch The Lollipop Man? We do, and we love him. Also, do you think that Mick Schumacher will be on the grid next year?"
Hi, James. I don't watch The Lollipop Man, but I am aware of it. I have I've seen it shared on social media a couple of times, and I did look it up when because Ed, when we were discussing beforehand, you made me aware of this question, so I wanted to have a little look, check that it was what I thought it was, and it is. I can see why you like it. It's quite a fun little way to follow Formula One.
Yeah, I'm going to be checking it out. I hadn't heard of it before this question, so thanks for the recommendation, James.
And on the second question, Mick Schumacher, I hope that you're not a Mick fan, because I don't really want to disappoint you, but I really do feel like Mick's chances of being on the grid are dwindling. This was a very Mick Schumacher weekend, wasn't it? A quite pointless performance in qualifying, and then quite a good drive in the Grand Prix, and then something went awry, so he didn't get the result that he probably deserved from it. It just felt like a bit Mick all round. So unfortunately, I just feel like Haas isn't totally convinced by him, and unfortunately he's running out of time to make his case and change their mind.
Yeah, he got some damage when he went through the debris field from the Stroll Alonso crash, so that hobbled him. He was in the mix for a points finish at that point, but yeah, that was a bit unfortunate. And Mark, the second question is from Hannah, who informs us she's Chris's daughter. Will the result of Max's championship be affected by the amount of money Red Bull spent last year? Is this overspend a major or minor issue? That's a big question.
It is, Hannah. That's a big question. I think there will be probably penalties coming, but I don't think it will be applied to the points that they've scored this year. No, I think it's more likely to be applied to restrictions in their wind tunnel time and things like that, and probably a money fine. So no, I don't think their points will be affected this year.
Yeah, and I think although technically it's called a minor breach, it is a major issue in this particular case. So it's a big talking point, but we'll soon have the full details of it. So we'll be able to give a slightly better appraisal of exactly how serious it is. And Scott, a connected question from Jeremy Husted. He says, could you please comment on some of the ludicrous stories regarding deducting championship points from Red Bull? It's necessary to have a hard cap, but the level of hypocrisy towards Red Bull Racing from other teams and certain outlets is overkill. Thanks, and keep up the neutral, fair reporting.
Well, I appreciate that, Jeremy, but all this does is just prove that nobody should ever read anything else and should just go to therace.com and not forget the hyphen. And then you'll be absolutely fine, and you'll be able to read everything that you need to know. On a more serious note...
Moving on to the less smug bit of the answer.
Yeah, exactly. I was just doing your bit for you to just make sure that people don't forget the hyphen. The serious thing is that there has been a lot of... There has been a lot of emotion around this story, and there has been a lot of, I think, misdirection might be the wrong word, but just slightly lazy characterizations of things on both sides, sometimes underplaying what has been done and sometimes overplaying it and calling for certain things. It is absolutely true that some people in Formula One have talked about what Red Bull has done as meriting a deduction of championship points, which if you did that for 2021 for Max Verstappen would impact the championship outcome. It or could impact the championship outcome. But the fact is that when, at least I hope that it's taken this way, when we've referenced like upper limits of things, for example, like the 5% that a minor breach refers to, meaning up to around $7 million. Like, we are not trying to imply that is what Red Bull overspent. We are just trying to frame it so that people understand what a minor breach can be. So, yeah, I think that around this there has been a bit of people being carried away at certain times. The main thing is to just try and cut through some of the hyperbole and the sort of extremism that, you know, gets people's attention and plays to that emotion a little bit, and just try to understand this story for what it is, which is a very serious one that is being taken very seriously and does have implications for Formula One in 2021, 2022 and beyond. And all you can do really is take all of that at face value, and then we will obviously try and cut through the nonsense as best we can. And we will be doing that when the FIA does come out with whatever its accepted breach agreement is with Red Bull, if indeed that is entered into. And if it goes to a bigger trial beyond that, then stick with us, because we'll go with it for as long as it lasts.
And I think the key thing to note is, if it is an accepted breach agreement, there cannot be a points deduction. The regulations list that some of the penalties are available, but the points deduction is off the table, as is the reduction in future cost cap spending. So you are into what Mark was talking about earlier, the reduction of aero testing and that kind of thing in terms of your punishment or a fine that is not part of the cost cap. So it's looking like points deductions won't be happening, and indeed cannot happen unless there is no ABA reached between the two parties, and I suspect it will in the end. Well, thanks very much, Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes, for your insights. Head to therace.com and definitely don't forget the hyphen, as there's loads to read there in terms of the fallout from the race and looking ahead to the upcoming Mexican Grand Prix as well. Also, if you haven't already done so, do download our new app. Just search for The Race Media on your app store of choice. Check out our other podcasts, including the Race IndyCar podcast, MotoGP and Bring Back V10s, and also have a look at our videos on YouTube. We're now going to head towards Mexico City, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Mexican Grand Prix.